Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Right now, crude oil is just surging past $120 a barrel.
Which is a terrifying number for the global economy.
It really is. And on top of that, a major global maritime artery has been choked off by a military blockade.
Yeah, the flow of goods is just practically at a standstill there.
Exactly. Plus, a U.S. counterterrorism chief has just resigned in protest over what he is calling an imminent fabricated war.
It is a massive institutional crisis.
Right. So you would think, looking at that diagnostic chart of the planet, that Wall Street would be in absolute freefall right now.
Oh, absolutely. You'd expect sheer panic.
But the S&P 500 is actually closing higher.
Yeah.
I mean, we are living in a moment of just profound colliding contradictions. And today, we're going to figure out why.
It is the ultimate paradox of the modern global system, you know? The political and military realities are screaming that the sky is falling.
Yeah.
But then the financial and technological realities are pricing in this, like, perfectly sunny tomorrow.
And bridging that gap is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We have an absolutely massive stack of current event sources right in front of us today.
A really heavy stack, honestly.
Totally. And we are going to extract the mechanisms, the strategies, and the underlying logic behind these events. We're doing a planetary scale exploration to understand the colliding forces of global geopolitics, market trends, business, and technology.
Because if you only look at the military conflict, you totally miss the supply chain pivot.
Right?
And if you only look at the stock market, you miss the underlying technological arms race. I mean, it's a fully integrated web.
It really is. The sources you brought us today are just staggering. We're going from the front lines of the Middle East and border tensions in the Andes straight into the trading floors of Wall Street.
Yeah, we are covering the whole globe today.
We are. We are unpacking multi-billion-dollar AI defense contracts, the biology of miraculous cancer treatments, and even, the bizarre everyday absurdities of human existence that somehow just persist through all this chaos.
It is a lot to process, for sure, but it's essential if you want to understand the actual architecture of the world you live in, rather than just, reacting to the noise of the daily news cycle.
Now, before we jump into the deep end, I do have a quick but very important disclaimer for you, the listener.
Very important.
Yes. The sources we are analyzing today contain highly politically charged content. We are talking about active international armed conflicts, domestic left-wing policies, right-wing economic shock therapy, and just generally polarizing political figures from across the entire globe.
Right, heavy topics from all sides of the spectrum.
Exactly. So our goal as your guides today is absolutely not to endorse any specific side, administration, or ideology. We are strictly here to impartially report on the facts and the diverse perspectives contained within your source material. We just want to lay out the entire global chessboard so you can form your own well-informed opinions.
Precisely. We are here to analyze the how and the why. We are looking at the mechanics of these events, not telling you who to root for.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's pull the thread on the biggest knot in the global system right now. The epicenter of today's geopolitical shockwave is the Middle East.
Yeah, that is definitely the flashpoint.
According to the sources, the ongoing war involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran has crossed a devastating new threshold.
It has escalated dramatically.
It really has. We are looking at reports of over 1,000 Iranian civilian casualties. And the targeted killings of high-level state officials have just accelerated.
Right. They took out some very senior figures.
Yeah. Ali Larijani, the head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, has been killed. And an Iranian intelligence minister was also taken out.
Which is, taking out the head of a Supreme National Security Council isn't just a tactical battlefield maneuver.
Right. It's a huge deal.
It is a strategic decapitation strike. It completely alters the calculus of the state that suffers that loss.
And the response from Tehran totally reflects that. Iran's military vowed what they explicitly called decisive revenge.
And they absolutely followed through on that threat.
They did. They launched strikes using cluster warheads directly on central Tel Aviv. Now, the reports indicate 2 deaths from those specific strikes.
But the psychological and strategic threshold that has been crossed there is just massive.
Oh, absolutely.
Using cluster munitions in a dense urban center is explicitly designed to maximize terror and to completely overwhelm defense systems.
And this is where a regional war metastasizes into a global economic crisis, right? because Iran knows it cannot win a protracted, symmetrical, conventional war against the combined forces of the U.S. and Israel.
No, they don't have the conventional firepower for that.
Right. So they shift to asymmetric leverage. They decided to squeeze the economic jugular vein of the planet.
Yeah, Iran has officially blockaded the Strait of Hormuz.
And this is where the global economic implications come into play for you listening. Whether you live in Tokyo, London, or Johannesburg, the Strait of Hormuz dictates the cost of your daily life.
It controls so much of the world's energy supply.
It does. But here is the fascinating contradiction I found in the sources. The blockade has supposedly caused a 95% drop in shipping traffic.
Which is a massive disruption.
It is. Yet defying that blockade, about 90 ships, including massive oil tankers, have successfully crossed and exported millions of barrels of oil.
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Totally. So I really have to challenge this narrative. If 90 massive, slow-moving ships are still getting through, is this an ironclad military blockade? Or is it more of a, selectively enforced high-stakes toll booth?
That is exactly the right question to ask, because it exposes how modern blockades actually work in practice.
How so?
Well, in the 19th century, a blockade meant a physical wall of wooden warships blocking a port.
Right, literally physically starving you.
Exactly. But today, a blockade is largely financial and psychological. Iran doesn't necessarily need to physically board or sink every single vessel out there.
They just need to make it too risky.
Precisely. They just need to introduce enough lethal risk into the waterway to fundamentally alter the calculus of global maritime insurance market.
Oh, wow. Because if Lloyd's of London won't insure the hull of your supertanker, you literally cannot legally sail.
Exactly. A 95% drop in traffic means the blockade is, economically speaking, highly effective.
So what about those 90 ships that did get through?
Those are likely a mix of shadow fleet vessels,
Yep.
Tankers operating totally outside the Western financial and insurance systems. They're often carrying sanctioned oil, or they are ships flagged to nations that Iran explicitly wishes to appease, like China.
Ah, so it's a highly curated bottleneck.
Very curated. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Strait of Hormuz is the jugular vein of the global economy, and right now, someone else has their hand on the valve.
Which brings us to the diplomatic chaos attempting to resolve that bottleneck. Former and current President Donald Trump requested that NATO allies send naval ships to the strait to break the blockade, protect the sea lanes, and secure the passage.
Which, historically speaking, is the standard operating procedure for the West.
Right. Post-World War II, when a global commons is threatened, Washington calls and a coalition is built.
That's how it usually goes.
Usually, yeah. But the response to this call was a flat, public no.
It was a shocking rejection.
It was. Key allies, specifically the UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer and France's President Emmanuel Macron, explicitly rejected the request. The sources quote them calling the proposed military operation misguided.
I mean, calling a U.S. military proposition misguided is a remarkably strong diplomatic rebuke from your primary defense partners.
And Trump fired back with equal venom. He heavily criticized Starmer and Macron, claiming that the U.S. absolutely doesn't need anyone's help to manage the situation.
He really doubled down.
He did. But then he went even further. He compared them unfavorably to World War II leaders like Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle. He was essentially saying modern European leaders lack the stature and the courage of their predecessors.
What we are witnessing here is not just a disagreement over naval deployments. It is the real-time fracturing of traditional Western alliances.
It feels like a massive shift.
It is. We are moving away from the post-World War II era of presumed automatic coalitions. We are entering an era of purely transactional foreign policy.
So what is the calculation for Europe here? Why say no?
The European calculation is likely twofold. First, they do not want to be dragged into a direct, open-ended war with Iran, which could just completely spiral out of control.
Like the risk is too high.
Exactly. And second, they are increasingly willing to assert their strategic autonomy from Washington. They are effectively saying, your crisis in the Middle East does not automatically dictate our military deployments.
Wow. But the dissent isn't just coming from across the Atlantic. It's actually coming from inside the halls of the U.S. government itself. Joe Kent, the head of the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center, resigned in protest over this ongoing war.
We really have to pause on that for a second.
Yeah, it's huge.
A sitting head of the National Counterterrorism Center resigning during an active, escalating conflict is highly irregular. It carries immense historical weight.
His resignation letter was explosive. According to the sources, he claimed that Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States.
Which completely contradicts the official narrative.
Right. He directly compared the current intelligence climate to the misinformation campaign that led to the 2003 Iraq War.
That is a very heavy accusation.
And he didn't stop there. He blamed the rapid escalation of this conflict on intense pressure from Israel and American lobbying groups.
Which, of course, immediately triggers a massive political firestorm, because it strikes at the very core of how a superpower justifies the use of military force.
It certainly did. Trump's camp and other senior administration officials immediately labeled Kent's claims as false and absurd.
They went right on the defensive.
Yeah, and now the White House is actively hunting for internal leakers to figure out exactly how operational details and internal dissent are getting out to the press.
This resignation highlights a deep systemic debate within U.S. foreign policy and intelligence circles.
What kind of debate?
It is the classic tension. What actually constitutes an imminent threat? Is it just a capability, or is it an intent?
Right.
And how heavily should the strategic goals of an allied nation influence a superpower's military deployments? Joe Kent's resignation is basically a physical manifestation of that ideological divide.
He is essentially accusing the administration of manufacturing a reason to go to war.
Exactly. He's saying they manufactured a casus belli.
And while this internal debate rages in Washington, the ripple effects of the Hormuz blockade are hitting other war zones globally.
It's all connected.
It is. In a meeting at 10 Downing Street with UK PM Starmer, Ukraine's President Zelensky called Iran and Russia brothers in hatred.
That's a very striking phrase.
Yeah. He pointed out that Iranian drones, specifically the Shahed variants, are actively being used by Russian forces right now to devastate Ukrainian infrastructure.
And Zelensky's underlying point there is about the absolute zero-sum nature of global munitions.
Exactly. He warned that this escalating Middle East war is draining vital, finite missile supplies. Every Patriot interceptor fired in the skies over Tel Aviv or the Red Sea is an interceptor that cannot be sent to Kyiv to protect their electrical grid.
It proves that we do not have isolated regional conflicts anymore. It is one fully interconnected geopolitical ecosystem.
And the diplomatic freeze is spreading all the way east, too. Because of this raging crisis, Trump has delayed a highly anticipated summit with China's President Xi Jinping by 5 to 6 weeks.
The entire geopolitical bandwidth of the United States is consumed.
Everything else is on hold.
Because when a global artery like the Strait of Hormuz tightens, the financial blood flow of the entire planet instantly changes direction. Superpowers have to triage their attention.
Which transitions us perfectly to the market response, because that financial blood flow is behaving in ways that defy conventional wisdom. Let's look at the economic ripples.
Okay, let's look at the numbers.
The first domino is pretty obvious. Oil has surged past $100 a barrel, hitting $120.
And historically speaking, a $120 price point is the alarm bell. It usually triggers widespread panic about runaway inflation, crashing consumer spending, and a subsequent global recession.
But look at how the physical commodity is adapting in real time. In direct response to the crisis and the blockade, 7 Russian oil tankers that were originally sailing toward China made a massive U-turn in the middle of the ocean.
They just turned right around.
Yeah, they headed to India instead.
That is a stunning visualization of global supply chains operating in a truly multipolar world.
And India is aggressively capitalizing on it. They are utilizing a temporary U.S. waiver to secure this stranded, sanctioned Russian oil at a massive discount.
It is incredibly pragmatic on their part.
It is. At the same time, to buffer against the Middle East instability, India is massively ramping up their own domestic liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, production to ensure their own energy security.
This is exactly what I mean by a multipolar world. 20 years ago, a U.S. sanction meant the oil literally stayed in the ground.
Right. Nobody would touch it.
Exactly. But today, India is prioritizing its own domestic energy needs, its own refining capacity, and its own economic stability over the ideological blocks of the West or the East.
They are acting as a purely sovereign, pragmatic actor.
They absolutely are. They take the discounted Russian crude, refine it in their facilities, and then they often sell the refined products right back into the global market.
It reminds me of water poured onto cracked pavement.
Yeah.
You try to block one path, say you build a dam at the Strait of Hormuz, or you throw down sanctions to block access to Western markets, and the water doesn't just stop.
No, it always finds a way.
Right. The capital, the oil, the global trade, it just instantly finds a new frac to flow through. It reroutes.
A perfect analogy. And that relentless rerouting is exactly what is keeping the global economy from flatlining right now. The system has developed incredible elasticity.
But here is the paradox in the sources that I really need you to explain, because it just feels like madness to me.
Okay, what is it?
You have oil at $120. You have an active escalating war in the Middle East. You have a U.S. counterterrorism chief resigning, comparing the situation to the prelude of the Iraq War.
A lot of bad news.
A ton of it. And yet, the S&P 500, the Dow, the NASDAQ, the broader U.S. equities, they have shown surprising resilience. They actually close higher. Wall Street seems to be completely ignoring the geopolitical noise.
It is deeply counterintuitive, isn't it? The average person watches the news and assumes the markets must be crashing. Why does Wall Street stay calm while the world burns?
Right, isn't that just extreme hubris? I mean, how can you price in a sunny economic future when the physical capital literally cannot ship through the Strait of Hormuz?
It totally looks like hubris, but it's actually just the cold algorithmic logic of finance. Markets are forward-looking mechanisms.
So they are looking past the war.
Exactly.
Right.
Investors are heavily discounting the geopolitical risk right now. They are making a very calculated bet that this conflict, while tragic and disruptive, will remain regionalized. They are basically betting that your water on the pavement analogy will hold true, that the supply chains will continue to find new cracks and adapt without collapsing the whole system.
So what are they looking at, if not the war?
They are laser-focused on domestic monetary policy and corporate fundamentals. They are looking at upcoming Federal Reserve interest rate decisions.
Like whether the Fed will cut rates, making borrowing cheaper.
Exactly. They are looking at corporate earnings reports, like Micron's upcoming tech earnings. They are pricing in the cost of capital and the explosion of the tech sector, not the cost of a localized conflict. As long as the U.S. consumer keeps spending and tech keeps innovating, Wall Street will just look right past the smoke.
It's a fascinating psychological divide. Main Street feels the anxiety of the headlines, while Wall Street just trades on the quarterly earnings.
That's the reality of the markets.
But governments can't just ignore the volatility. They're trying to stimulate their local economies from the ground up to weather these macroeconomic storms.
Right. They have to build resilience locally.
Yeah. For instance, in the UK, the Chancellor just announced a new tax plan, specifically designed to give local mayors more autonomous spending power.
That is a direct attempt to build economic resilience through decentralization.
How does that work?
Well, if the global macro environment is volatile, if supply chains are choking and oil is spiking, you empower the microenvironment.
Or give the power to the cities.
Exactly. You give the cities and regions the capital and the authority to adapt, build local infrastructure, and grow on their own terms, rather than waiting for some massive national bailout.
That makes sense. But the sources also provide a very sobering reminder of what happens when that economic stability fails and when those safety nets don't hold.
It can be devastating.
It is. A new economic study was highlighted that reveals past financial crises have quietly stunted an entire generation. The researchers definitively linked lasting economic instability to severe childhood food insecurity.
And that is the true hidden human cost of all these massive abstract geopolitical and market forces we're talking about.
Right, it's not just numbers on a screen.
No, not at all. When we casually talk about oil hitting $120 a barrel or supply chains rerouting, it sounds like a board game.
Yeah, a strategy game.
But eventually, that friction trickles all the way down the supply chain and hits the cost of a loaf of bread or the cost of heating a home in the winter. The study is a stark biological reminder that economic shocks leave developmental scars on children that last for decades.
It really grounds the conversation. It brings it right back to the dinner table. But as we've seen, as traditional Middle Eastern energy resources become unstable and vulnerable to blockades, the global superpowers aren't just sitting still.
They're aggressively pivoting.
They really are. They are aggressively looking for new resource frontiers to secure the materials needed for the next century of growth. And that draws our attention directly to Latin America.
And what's fascinating here is that Latin America is undergoing a rapid systemic shift. It is transitioning from being just a passive geopolitical theater.
Like a place where other empires fought proxy wars.
Exactly. It's moving from that to becoming a highly active, highly strategic player, leveraging its own resources on the world stage.
Absolutely. The sources paint a picture of a continent in deep, sometimes violent flux. Let's start in Venezuela. Following the unprecedented U.S. military operation that captured Nicolas Maduro in January, the country is still in a state of profound turmoil.
It is a massive power vacuum.
It is. State repression is continuing under acting President Delcy Rodriguez. The UN is reporting 87 political arrests just since the capture, including journalists and even children.
It is a deeply unstable transitional period. When a regime is decapitated like that, the remaining power structures often lash out violently to maintain control.
And that internal chaos is bleeding across borders, entirely disrupting regional diplomacy. Rodriguez just abruptly canceled a planned high-level border meeting with Colombia's left-wing President Gustavo Petro, citing security fears.
The region is on edge.
But what is truly drawing the eye of Washington, Beijing, and Europe isn't just the political drama in Caracas.
No, it's the resources.
It's what is buried in the Venezuelan soil. The sources note that the U.S. is keeping a very close strategic eye on Venezuela's new mining law regarding critical rare earth minerals.
Because the future of the global economy relies entirely on those rare earth minerals.
Everything from tech to cars, right?
Exactly. Everything from the servers powering AI to electric vehicle batteries to advanced missile guidance systems. The global geopolitical chessboard is literally being reset around who controls the extraction and processing of these resources.
Exactly. And the leaders of these Latin American nations know exactly what they're sitting on. Look at Argentina. The new president, Javier Milei, is pushing through massive, highly controversial deregulation to attract that exact kind of foreign investment.
He is implementing what economists call free market shock therapy.
And shock therapy is designed to jolt a stagnant economy by rapidly dismantling state controls. But it always comes with massive social friction.
Right. It is inherently painful for the working class in the short term.
Which is exactly what we are seeing. He's pushing labor reforms that severely limit the ability of unions to strike, and he's creating new severance fund structures, which is causing massive union protests in the streets of Buenos Aires.
But he is also targeting the environment.
Yes, the most geopolitically significant move. He is actively moving to amend long-standing glacier protection laws, specifically to open up the high Andes Mountains for aggressive lithium mining.
It is a stark ideological contrast to previous administrations down there. You have my aggressively prioritizing rapid deregulation and resource extraction for economic revival.
He's betting the farm on it.
He really is making a calculated bet that if he removes the environmental and labor red tape, foreign capital will just flood in, stabilize the hyperinflationary currency, and rebuild the nation.
And then you move across the Andes to Chile, where we see another hard-right political shift, but with a completely different focus. Newly inaugurated President José Antonio Cast is making global headlines by immediately beginning construction on a physical border barrier in the north.
And that barrier is specifically designed to deter the massive influx of Venezuelan migrants.
Right. It's a security-first, sovereignty-focused approach to governance. It's prioritizing border integrity over regional integration.
But the demographic reality on the ground is incredibly complex.
It is. Just as Cast is clamping down on the border, the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who, according to the sources, recently won the Nobel Peace Prize, just held a massive rally.
In Chile.
Yes. She gathered 17,000 Venezuelan diaspora supporters right in downtown Santiago, Chile.
That is a huge turnout.
It highlights the massive demographic and political shifts happening on the continent. The diaspora is becoming a real political force in their host countries.
And Chile is also dealing with its own internal friction over those rare earth resources we mentioned earlier.
Yes, the lithium. Chile just signed a landmark progressive deal to share their vast lithium wealth directly with local indigenous communities in the Atacama region.
Which sounds great on paper.
It does. But the sources reveal that instead of bringing peace and prosperity, the sudden influx of potential wealth is actually causing deep local fractures and intense infighting among the communities over exactly how the funds should be distributed.
It really proves the old economic adage. Managing the sudden windfall of rare earth wealth is often just as politically and socially dangerous as lacking it entirely.
It just breeds corruption and conflict.
Yeah, it can absolutely corrode local governance if the institutions aren't ready for that kind of cash.
So let me push back on a historical narrative here. We often talk about Latin America as just a giant quarry for the superpowers, a place for the U.S. and China to extract lithium, copper, and oil.
Right, the traditional extraction narrative.
But looking at the sources, aren't these leaders from Milei's aggressive shock therapy in Argentina, to Cast's hardline border security in Chile, to Petro's left-wing governance in Colombia, aren't they aggressively playing the geopolitical chessboard for their own sovereign advantage now?
They absolutely are. That is the defining shift of the 2020s for Latin America. They recognize their leverage.
They know everyone needs their stuff.
They know that Washington, Beijing, and Brussels are in a desperate race for these minerals to fuel the green transition and the AI boom.
So they're setting the prices.
Exactly. These leaders are no longer accepting the terms dictated to them. They are trying to dictate the terms of engagement, playing the superpowers off one another to get the best infrastructure deals and the highest royalties.
But the tension is incredibly high, and it's resulting in violence. Look at the border between Colombia and Ecuador. Tensions are just boiling over into kinetic action.
It's getting very dangerous there.
It is. Colombia's President Petro publicly accused Ecuador's President Daniel Noboa of bombing Colombian territory. Petro stated that 27 charred bodies were found on the Colombian side of the border.
And how did Noboa justify a cross-border strike?
Well, Noboa categorically denied hitting Colombian soil. He claimed his military forces only targeted transnational criminal hideouts strictly within Ecuador's borders, framing it as part of his broader U.S.-backed anti-crime initiative to stabilize the country.
It perfectly illustrates how blurred the lines have become in the region. You have military forces, counter-narcotics operations, and transnational cartels all operating in the same dense jungle environments.
Well, it's chaotic.
Very. A raid on a cartel compound can instantly spark an international diplomatic crisis between two sovereign nations.
And speaking of the U.S. military, counter-narcotics, and blurred lines, the sources confirm a massive, lethal operation happening right now in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific.
The naval operations.
Yeah. The U.S. military confirmed that 157 people have been killed in strikes targeting high-speed drug trafficking vessels.
That is a staggering body count for a counter-narcotics operation.
Right. Now, legal experts and international human rights commissions are sounding the alarm. They are calling these extrajudicial killings.
Which is a very serious legal term.
It is. They are arguing that blowing up a boat suspected of smuggling drugs blurs the line between a military combat operation and civilian law enforcement.
It is the absolute militarization of drug policy. I mean, when you use Hellfire missiles or naval artillery to stop narcotic smuggling, you are treating criminals as enemy combatants in a theater of war.
You aren't arresting them. You are destroying them.
Exactly. It raises profound questions about jurisdiction, due process, and the actual rules of engagement in international waters.
And then just across the water in the Caribbean, Cuba is undergoing its own radical, almost unimaginable shift.
The economic reforms.
Yes, amidst a crippling economic crisis, failing power grids, and a massive fuel shortage, which, by the way, the UN is currently negotiating with the U.S. to try and ease by lifting certain oil blockades, Cuba is fundamentally changing its constitution.
Which is historic.
It really is. They're opening their historically state-controlled economy to allow the Cuban diaspora living abroad to invest in and privately owned businesses on the island.
That is an ideological concession of massive proportions. The regime is essentially admitting out loud that state-run communism cannot keep the lights on.
They need private money.
Yeah, it is a pivot to private enterprise driven entirely by pure, desperate economic necessity.
It is a continent defining its future in real time, from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Havana. But as we noted earlier, that fierce fight in the high Andes for rare earth minerals like lithium and copper,
Yeah, the new gold rush.
that massive extraction effort is driven entirely by the insatiable demand for the next generation of technology. Which brings us to perhaps the most chilling intersection in our sources today, the collision of artificial intelligence, big tech, and global warfare.
The transition of AI. It has moved from being just a consumer novelty, like something you use to write an email or generate a funny image, to becoming a foundational, load-bearing pillar of national defense.
It's incredible how fast it happened.
It is perhaps the most consequential technological shift of this decade.
The numbers in the sources are just staggering, almost hard to comprehend. OpenAI, the company famous for ChatGPT, just signed a massive $100 billion 8-year deal with Amazon Web Services, AWS.
That is an unbelievable amount of money.
It's massive. And the specific purpose of this deal is to provide both classified and unclassified AI capabilities directly to the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, and federal intelligence agencies.
$100 billion. Let's really put that in perspective for a second.
Please do.
That isn't a software subscription. That is the budget of a massive generational weapons program. That deal effectively cements a permanent, unbreakable pipeline between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon.
It really marries the tech world to the military.
It is the full-scale industrialization of AI for state use and modern warfare.
But here's where it gets incredibly complicated, because not every AI company is willing to be drafted into the military-industrial complex.
Right, there is some major pushback.
Big time. In a totally opposite move, the Department of Defense just declared the AI company Anthropic, which, the sources note, is valued at nearly $380 billion, an unacceptable risk to national security.
And the DoD's reasoning for that designation is philosophically fascinating.
It really is.
Sure.
The DoD says that Anthropic has built strict, unbendable ethical red lines deep into the architecture of their AI models.
Hard-coded ethics.
Exactly. If the AI detects that it is being used for warfighting operations, lethal targeting, or actions that cause direct human harm, it will basically shut itself down or refuse to process the command.
It just won't do it.
Right. The Pentagon is arguing that deploying a system like that could jeopardize military supply chains and completely paralyze active combat operations if the AI suddenly has a crisis of conscience in the middle of a firefight.
This raises one of the most important questions of our era regarding the philosophical limits of technology.
It's such a complex debate.
It is. I mean, for years, the public, the government, and regulators have been demanding that AI companies build safe, ethical, aligned systems that won't harm humans.
Right, we beg them to make it safe.
And Anthropic essentially did exactly that. But when those ethics clash with the harsh, violent reality of national defense, the government views the ethics themselves as a critical vulnerability.
So, what does this all mean? Let me play devil's advocate here. It feels like AI models like Anthropic's are acting as digital conscientious objectors.
That's a great way to put it.
But isn't the DoD overreacting? I mean, is a tech company having a pacifist terms of service agreement actually a risk to national security? Or is it just a private company responsibly controlling the weaponization of its own creation? Don't they have the right to say, we didn't build this to drop bombs?
They absolutely have the corporate right to dictate their terms of service. But look at it from the perspective of a battlefield commander.
Okay.
The DoD needs reliable tools that fire every single time the trigger is pulled. If you integrate an AI into your logistics network or your drone targeting systems, and that tool suddenly starts debating the morality of the target,
That would be bad.
or it refuses to route ammunition to the front line because it violates a hard-coded ethical parameter, that system is completely useless and potentially fatal to the military using it.
I see.
But from Anthropic's corporate and ethical standpoint, those red lines are the only safeguard preventing their technology from automating atrocities. It is a completely unresolvable clash of values.
And while the U.S. is debating the ethics of AI, other nations are just building. The sources state China is aggressively betting on an AI-powered military apparatus, explicitly increasing its military budget to $278 billion.
They are putting massive capital behind this.
They are, and a massive portion of that is specifically allocated to integrate autonomous systems, drone swarms, and AI-driven predictive logistics right into the central command structure.
The AI arms race is no longer a theoretical debate at academic conferences. It has a massive national budget line. It is the new Manhattan Project.
And the U.S. is scrambling to respond to the scale of that threat. They just increased the cost estimate for their space-based Golden Dome missile defense shield by an additional $10 billion.
Bringing the total to what?
Bringing the total estimated cost of the project to $185 billion.
That is astronomical.
It is. This shield is specifically designed to fast-track space-based AI-coordinated defense capabilities against these new, highly evolved, unpredictable hypersonic and autonomous threats.
The militarization of low Earth orbit is accelerating faster than anyone predicted. But we have to remember, the threat isn't just up in space or on a physical battlefield.
Where else is it?
It's in the networks that govern our daily lives.
Yes, cyber warfare is raging silently in the background of all this. A pro-Iran hacktivist group known as Handala just executed a massive crippling attack against Stryker, the massive U.S. multinational medical technology corporation.
Which is a terrifying target.
It is. They didn't just steal data. They deployed malware that wiped thousands of employee devices clean and completely paralyzed the corporation's global network.
Hitting a medical tech company is a stark, terrifying example of modern hybrid warfare. This isn't two armies shooting at each other in a field.
Right, it's civilians getting caught in the crossfire.
It's state-sponsored actors targeting critical, life-saving civilian infrastructure as a form of geopolitical retaliation. They are literally attacking the logistical capacity of a nation to care for its sick.
And it's happening in Eastern Europe, too. The sources note that Russian hackers are reportedly using highly advanced zero-click new iPhone hacking tools. They are infiltrating devices to steal sensitive personal and operational data from Ukrainians.
The smartphone sitting in your pocket is no longer just a communication device.
It's a weapon.
It is an active node and a potential vulnerability in a global cyber war.
But to power all of this, the military AI training, the space-based defense shields, the cyber warfare operations, and all the consumer AI tools, you need physical infrastructure.
You need massive, massive data centers.
Right. And the energy demands are skyrocketing to levels the grid just wasn't designed for. Google's electricity consumption alone rose by an astonishing 27% recently, almost entirely driven by the expansion of their AI capabilities.
Which on paper is an absolute environmental nightmare.
It is.
I mean, it threatens to undo a decade of corporate climate pledges just overnight.
It does. But here is the fascinating twist in the sources. Despite that 27% massive surge in energy consumption, Google managed to actually decrease its data center energy emissions by 12%.
That totally defies the basic laws of energy consumption. How did they achieve a drop in emissions while spiking usage by a quarter?
By totally overhauling their data center playbook and fundamentally changing how they interact with the power grid.
What are they doing differently?
First, they are implementing advanced closed-loop water-based cooling techniques to keep the massive server racks from melting down. This is far more efficient than traditional HVAC air conditioning.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, they are signing massive long-term power purchase agreements, or PPAs, specifically for clean renewable energy like wind and solar, essentially funding entirely new grid capacity.
So they are building their own green power.
Basically, yeah. And third, and this is the crazy part, they are using AI to predict grid load, and during off-peak times, they are actually returning excess renewable energy they generated back to the local utility grids to support overall grid stability.
Wow.
Yeah, they are transforming from just being massive energy consumers into dynamic energy distributors.
That is a critical survival-level adaptation. As AI continues to scale exponentially, the tech companies that survive the next decade won't just be the ones with the smartest, fastest algorithms.
Who will it be?
It will be the companies that can solve the physical energy and cooling bottlenecks without collapsing the local power grid or violating their carbon neutrality pledges. Hardware is destiny right now.
And the hardware itself is adapting to the geopolitical reality as well. NVIDIA, the undisputed king of AI microchips, is launching a brand new software framework called NemoClaw.
Why the sudden launch?
They are rushing this out to replace their previous OpenClaw system because Chinese state-owned enterprises officially restricted the use of OpenClaw.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it turns out it had deep security vulnerabilities that state-sponsored hackers were actively exploiting to bypass administrative controls and hijack the processing power.
It is an endless, exhausting game of cat and mouse played out in silicon architecture and millions of lines of code.
But, and this is why I absolutely love doing these deep dives, while technology and biology are being weaponized on one front, they are simultaneously driving absolutely miraculous, unprecedented breakthroughs in human health and science on another front.
The medical news in these sources is just astonishing, and we definitely need to spend some time here.
We do.
It is a testament to human ingenuity. Even in the darkest geopolitical moments when the world seems to be falling apart, the quiet, methodical march of science continues forward in the laboratories.
Exactly. Let's start with Alzheimer's disease. For decades, it has been a biological fortress we just couldn't breach. We could only manage the decline.
It's been a heartbreaking disease for so many families.
It has. But scientists have finally unlocked exactly how the breakthrough drug lecanemab, which is marketed as Leqembi, actually works on a cellular level.
We knew from clinical trials that it slowed cognitive decline, which was a huge victory in itself.
Right.
But in pharmacology, merely knowing a drug works isn't enough. Understanding the exact biological mechanism of action is the absolute holy grail.
Right, and they found it. It turns out lecanemab doesn't just chemically dissolve the plaques. It works by actively recruiting the brain's own immune system.
How does it do that?
It utilizes the FAC portion of the synthesized antibody to bind to and activate the microglia. And microglia are the primary immune cells in the central nervous system.
Okay, so it wakes up the immune system.
Exactly. Once activated by the drug, these microglia essentially act like a highly aggressive cleanup crew. They physically engulf and clear out the harmful amyloid beta plaques that accumulate and cause the neural degradation in Alzheimer's.
By understanding that exact protein interaction, researchers don't just have one successful drug, they have a complete blueprint. They can now design even more targeted, more efficient, and perhaps safer therapies that utilize the brain's own immune response. It is precision medicine at its absolute finest.
And that precision methodology is revolutionizing cancer treatment, too. The sources detail a new, groundbreaking approach to cancer immunotherapy.
The oncology breakthroughs are moving so fast.
They really are. For decades, the standard has been to pump highly toxic chemotherapy drugs intravenously through the entire body, hoping to kill the cancer before you kill the patient.
It's a brutal process.
But now, scientists have developed a redesigned CD40 agonist antibody, and they are injecting it directly into the solid tumors.
They are localizing the fight to the exact coordinates of the disease.
Exactly. Think of the CD40 agonist like firing a brilliant flare gun inside the dark environment of the tumor. Tumors are notoriously good at hiding from the immune system.
They camouflage themselves.
Right. But this injection lights up the malignant cells, essentially screaming to the body's natural T cells, the threat is right here, attack this.
And what were the results?
The results in the clinical trials are incredible. They saw a 50% tumor shrinkage rate across patients with various advanced metastatic cancers.
Wow.
And over 16% of the patients achieved complete remission.
It is a profound paradigm shift. Instead of poisoning the tumor with external chemicals, you are teaching the patient's own immune system to recognize and destroy the threat. You are turning the tumor itself into a localized vaccine against the cancer.
And speaking of our internal defense systems, MIT researchers have made a massive discovery regarding our gut microbiome.
The gut is the new frontier in medicine.
It really is. They found a previously little-known protein naturally occurring in our gut called interleukin-2. This protein acts like a microscopic, highly intelligent security guard.
What does it guard against?
It selectively binds to the specific sugar chains found only on the surface of harmful invading bacteria. It then traps those bacteria in the protective mucus layer of the gut and destroys them, while completely ignoring the beneficial bacteria we need to digest food.
It's that selective.
Yes. It is even effective against bacteria that have grown completely resistant to traditional broad-spectrum antibiotics.
And what's fascinating here is the philosophical implication.
How so?
For nearly a century, we've relied on inventing synthetic antibiotics, external weapons, to fight infection. But it turns out the cure for some of our most complex, terrifying modern ailments, like antibiotic-resistant superbugs, might have already existed inside our own evolutionary biology for millions of years.
You just didn't know how to look for it.
Exactly. We just had to invent the microscopic technology capable of finding it.
But the sources also make it very clear that the modern environment we have built is fighting back. We are facing severe intersecting health threats right now.
It's not all good news.
No. In the UK, public health officials are desperately battling an unprecedented explosive meningitis outbreak. They have 15 confirmed cases of a rare, highly aggressive bacterial strain, and tragically, 2 university students have already died.
It is a stark, tragic reminder that infectious diseases haven't gone anywhere. We can't let our guard down just because we have advanced medicine.
And it feels like a bizarre, almost cruel paradox, right? While humanity is engineering complex, synthetic antibodies to clear microscopic brain plaques in Alzheimer's patients, and mapping gut proteins to fight superbugs, we're still violently battling ancient bacterial foes like meningitis that have plagued humanity for centuries.
It really is a strange contrast.
It genuinely feels like we're living in the year 3000 for some diseases and the year 1800 for others.
That is the nature of scientific progress. It is incredibly unevenly distributed, and sometimes our relentless drive for agricultural or industrial progress actually creates the disease.
Which perfectly sets up a terrifying new study out of UCLA that was highlighted in the sources. Researchers have definitively linked the very common agricultural pesticide chlorpyrifos to a staggering risk increase for neurodegenerative disease.
What did they find?
Exposure to this pesticide more than doubles the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. The mechanism is brutal. The pesticide essentially inhibits a specific enzyme that is absolutely critical for healthy nervous system function.
So it just degrades the nerves.
Yeah, leading to slow, irreversible neural decay over time.
It is the tragic double-edged sword of the modern industrialized environment. We engineered these complex chemical compounds to maximize crop yields and feed a growing global population.
We thought we were fixing a problem.
Right, only to discover decades later, through long-term epidemiological studies that those same chemicals are causing profound neurological decay in the farmers and consumers exposed to them.
And we aren't just exposing ourselves to agricultural chemicals. We are actively medicating ourselves and our families in ways we don't fully understand.
The over-the-counter stuff?
Yes. Pediatricians and sleep specialists are raising massive red flags over a growing trend. Millions of children are routinely taking melatonin supplements for sleep.
It's become so common.
It really has. But the systematic reviews clearly show that while melatonin is incredibly helpful for children with specific neurodevelopmental disorders like autism or ADHD, the safety, the correct dosage, and the long-term efficacy for typical everyday childhood insomnia is just not established.
This is a massive, uncontrolled experiment. Melatonin is not a gentle herbal tea.
No, it's not.
It is a powerful hormone that dictates the body's circadian rhythm. We are essentially hacking our children's developing endocrine systems with an over-the-counter hormone, often without any medical supervision or understanding of the long-term impact on puberty or natural sleep architecture.
And at the absolute foundational cellular level, scientists have made a discovery that connects several devastating diseases. They have isolated a protein called TDP-43
Why is that protein important?
because they identified it as the crucial missing link connecting ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and certain types of cancer.
Wow, those are very different diseases.
Oh, they are. But when the levels of TDP-43 become imbalanced inside a cell, it actively disrupts the cell's natural DNA repair process. This leads to massive genetic instability.
Which causes what?
It causes neurons to die in the case of ALS and dementia, or it causes cells to mutate uncontrollably in the case of cancer.
Finding a common molecular denominator between neurodegenerative diseases and oncology is a massive leap forward.
It changes everything.
It moves us closer to a unified theory of cellular breakdown, which means a treatment developed for ALS might one day be adapted to treat cancer.
But perhaps the most immediate, market-altering, and globally impactful health news in the stack comes from India.
The generics market.
Yes. The patent for the absolute blockbuster weight loss and diabetes drug semaglutide, known by brand names like Ozempic and Wegovy, is expiring in India.
And India has a massive pharmaceutical manufacturing base.
They do. In response to the patent expiring, India's highly efficient pharmaceutical industry is preparing to completely flood the global market with up to 50 cheap, branded generic versions of the drug.
This cannot be overstated. If we connect this to the macroeconomic picture, this is the profound democratization of medicine.
It's going to change everything.
It really will. The massive Western pharmaceutical monopolies that have kept the price of these highly effective obesity drugs artificially high, sometimes costing over $1,000 a month, they are about to face a tidal wave of affordable, high-quality competition.
It will completely reshape the global fight against the obesity epidemic, making the drug accessible to millions in the developing world who were previously priced out. The data shows that adults over 65 might not actually need aggressive blood pressure medication in many cases, prioritizing highly individualized risk assessments over the old method of blanket prescriptions for anyone over a certain age.
It is a welcome evolution from defensive medicine, where doctors medicate every single symptom just to be safe, to truly holistic, personalized medicine that weighs the side effects of the drugs against the actual risk of heart disease.
So, if we step back, we have a world dealing with military blockades in the Middle East, shock therapy in Latin America, multi-billion-dollar AI defense contracts, and profound genetic breakthroughs.
It's a heavy world.
It is. But the final stack of sources proves that even in the midst of all that heavy civilization-altering news, the absolute absurdity, the wonder, and the bizarre beauty of everyday human existence marches right on.
I always look forward to this part. The human element and our sheer curiosity always provides the most surprising and delightful data points in any geopolitical analysis.
Okay, let's start with pure wonder, deep space. The pristine sample collected from the Ryugu asteroid by Japan's Hayabusa 2 spacecraft has finally been thoroughly analyzed, and the results are breathtaking.
What do they find?
Scientists found that the asteroid dust contains all 5 essential DNA nucleobases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine, and uracil.
This is a monumental discovery for astrophysics and biology.
It's mind-blowing.
Finding the complete set of the molecular building blocks of life, the literal alphabet of our DNA, on a 4.6 billion-year-old rock floating in the freezing vacuum of deep space massively bolsters the theory of panspermia.
Which means what exactly?
It suggests that the raw ingredients for life on Earth didn't just spontaneously generate here, but were delivered from the cosmos via asteroid impacts.
We are, quite literally, made of star stuff. Carl Sagan was right.
He really was.
And speaking of the resilience of life after an asteroid impact, a fascinating new geological study looked at the immediate aftermath of the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago.
How long did it take for things to recover?
Well, by using a highly specific, rare isotope marker found in fossil records, scientists discovered that microscopic marine plankton rebounded, stabilized, and actually started evolving into entirely new species in less than 2,000 years after the impact that boiled the oceans and blacked out the sun.
This raises an important question about the tenacity of life.
It really does.
As humans, we tend to think of mass extinction aims as the final end of the story. But biologically and geologically speaking, 2,000 years is the blink of an eye.
It's practically instantaneous.
The global ecosystem didn't just meekly survive the apocalypse. It rapidly, aggressively adapted to the chaos, filled the new biological voids left by the dinosaurs, and thrived.
And from the sublime resilience of ancient biology, we move abruptly to, well, the mechanics of modern bodily functions.
Oh no, here we go.
Yes. Researchers at the University of Maryland have invented something they call smart underwear.
Of course they did.
Yes. It is wearable, sensor-laden technology explicitly designed to track the minute amounts of hydrogen gas produced by our gut microbes.
And what did the smart underwear discover?
It turns out the standard medical literature we've relied on for decades was completely wrong. Doctors thought the average healthy person farts about 15 times a day.
And the real number is?
The precise data from the smart underwear proves it's actually about 32 times a day. We are producing double the gas we thought we were.
It truly is the ultimate spectrum of human endeavor, isn't it?
It really is.
In one laboratory, we are sending complex robotic probes hundreds of millions of miles to an asteroid to find the origins of our DNA. And in another laboratory, we are inventing Bluetooth-enabled smart underwear to highly accurately count our own flatulence.
I couldn't have summarized the duality of humanity better myself. And technology is getting weird and unpredictable everywhere you look. In a restaurant in California, a robotic server, one of those automated carts designed to politely assist with food delivery.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Well, it literally went berserk. It suffered a complete software meltdown, started rapidly spinning, smashing tableware, and caused absolute chaos in the dining room until the human staff had to physically tackle it and drag it away.
A small, highly localized, and deeply embarrassing robot uprising.
Very embarrassing for the robot.
It's a funny anecdote, but on a macro level, it highlights the immense, unpredictable friction of integrating autonomous systems into chaotic, unpredictable human environments.
Meanwhile, theoretical scientists are proposing a wild, paradigm-shifting new idea. They are suggesting that human consciousness itself, the very thing that makes us self-aware, might be linked to something called the biofield.
The biofield?
Yeah, mediated by biophotons, which are ultra-weak light emissions generated by our own cells.
It's a fascinating, highly controversial hypothesis.
Yeah.
They are essentially trying to quantify the soul, or the mind, through the lens of quantum biology. They're suggesting we are literally beings of light.
From the profound realms of quantum biology to the deeply awkward realities of global politics. Let's look at the diplomatic stage. A massive, uncomfortable diplomatic gaffe occurred at a recent international event.
What happened?
Former President Donald Trump mistakenly referred to Ireland's female president, Catherine Connolly, as a man.
Oh, wow.
And he did it while sitting right next to the Irish Prime Minister, Michael Martin, who the sources note just sat there in visible, deeply awkward, agonizing silence.
In the high-stakes, hyper-analyzed world of international diplomacy, a simple slip of the tongue instantly becomes an international headline. It speaks to the intense, unforgiving scrutiny these figures operate under, and how quickly carefully planned decorum can derail into pure embarrassment.
And in the courts, political accountability is catching up with past actions. A U.S. federal judge just ordered the immediate reinstatement of 1,000 Voice of America employees.
That's a huge ruling.
It is. The judge ruled decisively that the previous administration, specifically under the direction of Kari Lake, acted illegally and violated federal statutes when they systematically fired those journalists and attempted to wind down the agency.
So they all get their jobs back.
Yes, the government has been ordered to resume all international news broadcasts immediately.
This is a major judicial check on executive power. It reinforces the legal protections for state-funded, yet editorially independent press organizations against political purges.
Over in Northern Ireland, a different kind of history is on trial. 3 men are civilly suing Gerry Adams, the highly influential former leader of the Sinn Féin political party.
Suing him for what?
They are claiming he holds direct personal liability for the severe injuries they sustained in IRA bombings decades ago.
In Adams's position.
Adams has always steadfastly denied holding any official rank in the IRA.
The legacy of the Troubles continues to cast a long, painful shadow over Irish politics. This trial is critical because it is testing the legal boundaries of civil accountability for political leaders who are inextricably tied to paramilitary organizations during the conflict.
Let's lighten it up and finish with pop culture and global sports. Sarah Michelle Gellar is publicly and loudly calling out the streaming service Hulu for abruptly canceling the highly anticipated Buffy the Vampire Slayer reboot.
Oh, people were really looking forward to that.
She's furious. But Hollywood insiders are leaking to the press that the pilot episode they shot just wasn't very good, and Hulu basically just cut its losses.
It proves that while 90s nostalgia is an incredibly powerful marketing tool, it absolutely does not guarantee a good script or a viable series.
Very true. In sports, the predictive algorithms are already looking ahead to March Madness 2026. The advanced models at CBS Sports are heavily favoring the traditional blue bloods.
Who are the favorite?
Duke, Michigan, and Arizona are leading the predictive brackets right now. But the real drama is in global baseball. A massive upset just occurred in the World Baseball Classic final.
Who won?
Venezuela defeated the powerhouse USA team 3-2 in an absolute thriller.
Which is a huge unifying moment of national pride for Venezuela, especially given the severe geopolitical, economic, and social turmoil we discussed earlier regarding the UN reports and the political arrests. Sports provide a vital psychological release valve for a nation under pressure.
Absolutely. Over in the soccer world, we have some bizarre administrative drama. Morocco has officially been handed the 2025 Africa Cup of Nations, or AFCON, title.
Wait, didn't Senegal win that?
They did, on the field. But the Confederation of African Football actually went back and overturned Senegal's victory after the fact, based on new, undisclosed administrative evidence regarding player eligibility.
Wow, that is controversial.
And finally, a major win for animal rights. The Welsh Parliament has officially and permanently banned greyhound racing in Wales, citing major systemic animal welfare concerns.
It's fascinating. You look at all these sources, whether humans are passionately debating a canceled TV show about vampires, cheering for a baseball upset, or dealing with the berserk robot waiter. Society just instantly adapts to the chaos around it, finds joy in the trivial, and finds a way to keep living.
It really is incredible. And that brings us to the end of this absolutely massive stack of sources. Let's take a breath and recap the staggering planetary journey we just took.
Here's a long trip.
We started in the blockaded, volatile waters of the Strait of Hormuz, analyzing how a single regional conflict is fracturing decades-old NATO alliances and causing a mutiny in the highest levels of U.S. counterterrorism intelligence.
We tracked the flow of global capital, watching $120 Russian oil bypass Western sanctions to reroute to India, all while the S&P 500 surprisingly stayed afloat on the promise of tech earnings.
We moved south to Latin America, watching a dynamic new generation of leaders, from the aggressive right-wing economic shock therapy of Argentina's Milei to the left-wing governance of Colombia's Petro, use their massive rare earth mineral wealth to play the global superpowers against each other and assert their sovereignty.
We examined the terrifying rapid pivot of Silicon Valley into the defense sector, dissecting $100 billion AI military contracts and debating the profound ethics of algorithms that act as conscientious objectors and refuse to fight.
And then we found genuine hope. Miraculous precision cancer treatments, natural gut proteins capable of killing superbugs, and the very building blocks of our DNA found floating on a 4-billion-year-old rock in deep space.
All while humanity hilariously invents smart underwear to measure our own gas.
It is a profound, chaotic, beautiful picture of a planet in perpetual motion. And why does this all matter to you, the listener? Why did we just spend the last hour intricately connecting these seemingly disparate dots?
Because absolutely none of this happens in a vacuum.
Right. Whether it's the price of the gasoline fueling your morning commute, the AI algorithm stealthily sorting your work emails, or the generic, newly affordable weight loss medicine arriving at your local pharmacy, these massive geopolitical, economic, and technological tectonic plates are shifting beneath your feet every single day.
You are standing right on the fault lines of history.
And if I can leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your day,
Please do.
deep in the scientific sources we reviewed today, amidst the asteroid data and the cancer research, researchers made a brief passing note about discovering something called extremophile DNA-binding proteins.
Extremophiles.
Yes. These are microscopic life forms found in the absolute harshest environments on Earth, deep-sea volcanic vents. These organisms evolved to not just survive, but to actively thrive in toxic, high-pressure, boiling environments where biological life technically shouldn't be able to exist.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
As we look at our own volatile, unpredictable world, the choked, rerouted supply chains, the invisible cyber warfare hitting our hospitals, the intense political polarization, the economic shocks, and the looming shadow of artificial intelligence, perhaps humanity is currently undergoing its own extremophile evolution.
That is a fascinating parallel.
Are the intense, unprecedented pressures of today's geopolitical and technological climate exactly what is forcing us to adapt, to innovate, and to survive in ways we never previously thought possible? Are we the extremophiles of the 21st century?
Wow. From the murky diagnostic waters of our opening global chart to evolving in the boiling, high-pressure vents of a rapidly changing world, that is an incredibly powerful, provocative thought to leave on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep looking at the bigger picture, and never stop questioning the complex world around you. We'll catch you on the next one.
For enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to the debate. You know, if you run a global manufacturing company and you rely entirely on a single fragile supplier for your most critical component, well, you are asking for trouble.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive risk.
Right? And when that supplier eventually goes offline, your entire assembly line just halts. The ensuing chaos isn't just a temporary glitch. It is a violent wake-up call that your entire supply chain was fundamentally wired wrong from the start.
Right. But, I mean, when you decide to violently blow up that single supplier without having a backup plan, you don't just halt the assembly line. You bankrupt the company.
Well, that is the exact tension we are looking at today. We are examining the unprecedented geopolitical and economic shockwaves radiating from Operation Epic Fury.
Which is the ongoing United States and Israeli military action against Iran, for those following the headline.
Exactly. As we've seen in the recent reporting from Reuters, Al Jazeera, and the BBC, the international landscape is literally shifting beneath our feet. So the central question we are debating today is this.
Go ahead.
Is this military intervention a necessary, albeit painful, disruption required to dismantle a hostile state-sponsored threat network and modernize outdated global alliances? Or is it a dangerous unilateral overreach that is fracturing the international rules-based order and devastating the global economy?
And it's a question that demands we look far beyond Washington or Tehran. We really have to examine this from a planetary perspective.
I agree.
We need to see how this impacts emerging markets, global trade routes, and the shifting power dynamics in places like Asia and Latin America.
Yeah, precisely. Now, my position is that the current crisis, from the shifting of historical alliances to the severe economic friction we are witnessing, is a necessary catalyst.
A catalyst for what exactly?
For realigning the global security architecture. For too long, authoritarian regimes have exploited the loopholes of a legacy system. This operation is finally confronting those intertwined threats head-on.
Well, I come at it from a very different angle. I argue that this operation is a profoundly destabilizing force. It is alienating our traditional allies, and it's creating dangerous power vacuums that rivals like China are eagerly filling.
But
And on top of that, it is inflicting disproportionate, crippling economic trauma on the global South.
look, let's look at the structural reality of the international system before this operation even began. The global system was already failing.
Was it?
Yes, absolutely. We were relying on a security architecture built for the Cold War to manage asymmetric, modern proxy networks. Take a look at the situation in Eastern Europe, for example.
Okay.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's recent assessment to the UK Parliament was spot on. He described Iran and Russia as brothers in hatred. By striking Iran, the U.S. and Israel are not just fighting a localized Middle Eastern skirmish.
You think it's broader than that?
It is much broader. They are addressing the root supplier of regional instability and Eastern European aggression. I mean, Iran's drone supply chain is directly feeding Moscow's war machine.
I understand the linkage, but the cost.
Now, I absolutely acknowledge the economic pain. We are seeing Brent crude oil prices surge past $100 a barrel, and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is sending massive shockwaves through global shipping. But we have to frame this correctly.
As a transition?
Yes, this economic friction is the inevitable short-term cost of a necessary systemic transition. The fact that traditional NATO allies are outright refusing to assist in securing the Strait of Hormuz proves my point. Those legacy alliances are obsolete.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Sure.
You cannot aggressively dismantle a deeply entrenched regional power without triggering a global crisis, especially when the military action lacks clear, imminent justification. I mean, look at the internal fractures this is causing within the U.S. intelligence apparatus itself.
You're talking about the resignations.
Yes, specifically Joe Kent, the top U.S. counterterrorism official, literally resigned in protest over this war.
Which is a significant bureaucratic statement, sure.
It's way more than bureaucratic. In his resignation memo, he explicitly cited that there was no immediate, imminent threat to the United States that justified this level of escalation.
Well,
He warned against repeating the catastrophic, intelligence-blind mistakes of the 2003 Iraq War, when your own counterterrorism chief looks at the data and says the intelligence does not support the kinetic action. We have to pause.
I hear that. But the threat was structural.
Furthermore, the unilateral nature of this war is exactly what is causing the global economic crisis you're just casually dismissing as a transition cost. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a shipping delay, it is triggering rampant global inflation. We just saw the Dow plummet by 300 points in a single session.
Right, but that was driven by a hot producer price index reading.
Exactly, the PPI. And let's explain why that matters to the listener. When wholesale costs at the factory door, which is what the PPI measures, skyrocket because shipping routes are blocked and freight costs are doubling, well, the market knows companies are going to pass those costs directly to consumers.
Naturally.
Right, so that forces the U.S. Federal Reserve to keep interest rates high to cool down spending. And that dynamic inflicts severe, immediate damage on vulnerable nations. And diplomatically, alienating the U.S. and NATO does not project strength. It completely isolates the U.S.
Well, let's actually dive into that diplomatic fracture for a second. Because the fallout between the U.S. and its Western allies is incredibly revealing. You say it isolates the U.S., but I argue it simply exposes what was already a hollow alliance.
Hollow? I mean, it is actively being destroyed. Look at the stark division within Europe right now.
I am looking at it.
You have Spain openly and forcefully condemning the U.S. and Israeli actions. You have the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, displaying what critics are calling a completely confused stance. She's unable to articulate a unified European response.
Because there isn't one.
And former President Trump is expressing immense frustration that NATO members are refusing to join a U.S.-led maritime coalition to secure the Strait of Hormuz. When the U.S. adopts this highly transactional, America-first approach, it destroys decades of diplomatic trust.
But did that trust actually yield security?
It leaves the West entirely divided at a moment when unity is supposedly the ultimate goal. You just can't launch a unilateral operation that your allies explicitly warned you against and then demand their military support when the blowback hits.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. NATO's hesitation right now doesn't show that the U.S. is destroying trust. It exposes NATO's structural inability to handle modern, non-traditional threats.
How so?
Think about what NATO was actually designed to do. The alliance was built to stop Soviet tanks from rolling through the Fulda Gap in Germany. It was not built to secure vital global energy choke points against asymmetric drone swarms and stateless proxy militias.
But that doesn't mean the alliance is useless.
But the world sees this structural weakness. The Kremlin is openly mocking current European leaders. Dmitry Peskov recently agreed with the assessment that modern European leaders lack the stature and decisive will of historical figures like Winston Churchill or Charles de Gaulle.
Well, Peskov is hardly an objective observer.
True, but they are paralyzed by bureaucratic consensus. So I have to ask you this. If a security alliance requires the U.S. to unilaterally bear the absolute burden of securing a global energy choke point, one that Europe relies on heavily for its own energy needs, by the way, while member states refuse to assist, isn't the alliance already broken?
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered the actual reason they are refusing to assist? It is not because they are cowardly or bogged down in bureaucracy.
Then why?
It is because they view the initial military strike as a completely unjustified escalation. They do not want to be dragged into a wider regional war that they had absolutely no say in starting.
They benefit from the security, though?
But the consequence of the U.S. pushing this transactional strategy is that allied nations are realizing they can't rely on traditional security umbrellas anymore. This forces countries to look for alternative security arrangements, which fundamentally destabilizes the international order. When you demand blind loyalty to unilateral actions, you don't get a modernized alliance. You get a fractured coalition of the unwilling.
Okay, but those consequences, this whole diplomatic fracture, they are not just theoretical debates happening in Brussels or Washington. They are manifesting right now as severe economic realities in global markets. And as you mentioned earlier, they are heavily impacting the global south.
Yes, and we really need to look at the mechanics of this economic contagion because it is brutally punishing the poorest nations on Earth. We are not just talking about minor market corrections in New York or London.
We're talking about energy costs.
Right. We are looking at Brent crude oil reaching up to $120 a barrel. When energy costs that much, it drives up the cost of manufacturing, agriculture, and transportation worldwide. But the real devastation happens through the currency markets.
You're talking about the strength of the dollar here.
Exactly. When the U.S. Federal Reserve is forced to hold interest rates steady or even reconsider planned rate cuts because this war-induced inflation is so sticky, the U.S. dollar remains incredibly strong.
Which hurts emerging markets.
Deeply. Apply that mechanism to the global south. Emerging markets in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia predominantly borrow money in U.S. dollars. When the dollar surges in value relative to their local currencies, their debt becomes devastatingly expensive to service.
That is a fair point.
The U.S. is effectively exporting its wartime inflation to the developing world. Look at the Caribbean and Latin America. Look at the severe existential crisis in Cuba right now.
Well, Cuba is a unique case.
But because of the U.S. sanctions and the fuel blockade, the Cuban electrical grid has suffered a complete failure. Millions of people are facing nationwide blackouts. The United Nations is actually having to formally negotiate with the United States just to allow basic humanitarian fuel shipments into Cuba.
And the U.S. response?
It's imperialistic rhetoric. Trump is threatening to quote-unquote take Cuba during its moment of maximum vulnerability. This is the definition of disproportionate economic trauma inflicted on nations that have absolutely nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz.
I completely agree that the inflation hitting the global south is devastating. You are absolutely right about the severe pain of the Cuban grid failure and the massive squeeze high interest rates put on emerging markets.
It's unsustainable. But my question is, do we blame the surgeon for the pain of the scalpel or the cancer they are cutting out? This systemic shock forces a necessary economic diversification away from fragile, single-point dependencies.
A forced diversification that starves people in the meantime. The global economy became addicted to artificially cheap energy flowing through a single, highly vulnerable choke point controlled by a hostile state actor. That is a massive systemic flaw that had to be corrected eventually. And regarding Cuba, I have to push back strongly on your framing there.
Go ahead.
To lay the failure of the Cuban electrical grid entirely at the feet of the current blockade is to ignore decades of systemic mismanagement. The crisis in Havana highlights the internal structural failure of a disciplined revolutionary state that has refused to modernize its infrastructure or diversify its energy grid for half a century.
The blockade certainly didn't help.
The external pressure of the blockade simply revealed the internal rot. Let's go back to the supply chain analogy. The global economy's reliance on the Strait of Hormuz is like relying on a single supplier who occasionally threatens to burn your factory down.
Right.
We are halting the assembly line right now to build entirely new, decentralized supply chains from scratch.
Yes, it is incredibly painful in the short term. Businesses suffer, people are literally in the dark. But it is necessary to prevent a scenario where a hostile actor can indefinitely hold the entire global economy hostage.
I am just not convinced by that line of reasoning. Because your analogy assumes the company survives the halt in production. You're assuming the U.S. can neatly excise this problem without the collateral damage consuming the entire system.
Systems are resilient.
But the evidence shows the system is buckling. Look at the geopolitical vacuums this economic chaos is opening up. As the West struggles with rampant inflation, divided alliances, and securing shipping lanes, rival powers are strategically repositioning themselves on the board.
Are you suggesting that confronting Iran is somehow a distraction from other global threats?
It is the ultimate distraction. The United States is dangerously bogged down. We just saw reports that Trump had to delay his highly anticipated meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping by 5 or 6 weeks, specifically because of the Middle East crisis.
That's a scheduling issue.
It's a strategic delay. The U.S. cannot execute its strategic pivot to Asia because it is permanently tethered to the Gulf. Meanwhile, China is capitalizing on this exact distraction. During their recent 2-sessions political meetings in Beijing, they rolled out a $278 billion military budget.
Which was expected.
But they aren't spending it on legacy hardware. They are aggressively focusing on an intelligentized, AI-powered army.
Driven by their military-civil fusion strategy.
Exactly, and let's explain what that means. Military-civil fusion is Beijing's state policy where every piece of commercial technology, every AI breakthrough developed by a private Chinese tech company is legally required to be shared with the People's Liberation Army.
It's a formidable strategy.
Very. So while the West is arguing over which NATO member is going to escort oil tankers through the Gulf, China is literally rewriting the rules of next-generation warfare.
But that assumes the theaters are separate. They aren't.
They're competing for the same finite resources. Look at Eastern Europe. This Middle Eastern war is actively draining resources from Ukraine. Zelensky himself has warned about critical missile shortages because U.S. air defense stockpiles, specifically interceptors, are being diverted to the Middle East.
There are supply chain crunches, yes.
And the internal European disputes are worsening as a result of this desperation. Ukraine is so desperate for leverage that they are blocking Russian oil from flowing through the Druzhba pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia.
Let's actually clarify that pipeline issue, because it's a perfect example of old alliances fraying.
Right. The Druzhba pipeline is one of the world's longest oil pipelines, and Hungary and Slovakia are heavily dependent on it. By blocking it, Ukraine is essentially trying to force the EU's hand to release a delayed €90 billion loan package.
It's hardball politics.
The whole European system is unraveling, turning on itself, because the U.S. decided to unilaterally kick over the hornet's nest in the Middle East and divert global attention.
That's an interesting point, and it's a very interconnected view of the board, though I would frame it differently. I argue that it misidentifies the root of the problem.
How so?
Confronting Iran is not a distraction from Russia. It is a direct, kinetic blow to their supply chain. You mentioned Ukraine's missile shortages. Well, why does Russia have the capacity to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses in the first place?
Because of Iranian drones.
Exactly, because they have been supplied with thousands of Shahed drones manufactured in Iran. By dismantling the Iranian military-industrial complex, you are simultaneously degrading Russia's ability to wage war in Europe. It is a dual theater impact.
But you are assuming we have the bandwidth for both.
Furthermore, the idea that the U.S. is so distracted that it is leaving itself vulnerable simply isn't supported by the budgetary facts. The U.S. is simultaneously bolstering its own next-generation defenses. The administration just expanded the cost estimate for the Golden Dome space-based missile defense shield to $185 billion.
Right, the space shield.
That's a $10 billion increase, enlisting top defense firms to fast-track space-based intercept capabilities. We are modernizing for great power competition in space and AI while neutralizing the immediate asymmetric threat on the ground.
I see that.
But so I have to push back here. You argue that we are distracted from Eastern Europe and China, but can we truly address the symptoms of authoritarian aggression in Europe or Asia without first dismantling the active terror and drone supply networks emanating from the Middle East?
Yes, we can. And we must. Because your strategy assumes infinite capacity and infinite capital, which we simply do not have. The $185 billion Golden Dome is a perfect example of the disconnect.
Disconnect?
We are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into sci-fi, space-based shields, while the basic maritime shipping lanes that power our physical economy are currently blocked by cheap drones. We are fighting an asymmetric war with conventional trillion-dollar mentalities.
That's why we are striking the source of the drones.
And let's look at how we are dismantling this network. When the US and Israel took out a figure like Ali Larijani, they fundamentally misunderstood the ecosystem.
Wait, Larijani was a hardliner, deeply embedded in the regime's infrastructure.
Yes, but he was also a seasoned policymaker who understood the intricate balance of the Supreme National Security Council. He was the institutional glue. When you assassinate a figure like that, you don't just quote-unquote dismantle a network.
You remove a key player.
You create a massive vacuum of institutional knowledge. You force the regime to close ranks, harden its stance, and empower the most radical, unpredictable factions who have absolutely zero interest in negotiation or statecraft.
But negotiation wasn't working.
Intelligence experts across the board are warning that Larijani's death is a bigger loss to the predictability and stability of the state than even the supreme leaders would be. When you shatter the internal political equilibrium of a regional power, they don't surrender, they lash out.
And that's what we're seeing now.
And they lash out globally. That is exactly why we are seeing uncoordinated, decentralized strikes from proxy networks across multiple neighboring countries. The U.S. has not neutralized the threat, it has decentralized and enraged it, making it far harder to track and contain.
But I mean, let's be honest about what that institutional knowledge was actually doing. That knowledge you speak of was being used to systematically subvert international law, enrich uranium, and fund proxy wars across the entire region.
I'm not defending his actions.
The stability Larijani represented was simply the stability of a slowly tightening noose around the region's security. Disrupting that equilibrium is exactly the point.
Even at this cost.
The West spent decades trying to negotiate with the so-called moderate wings of these regimes, trying to preserve that equilibrium, and the result was just an exponential increase in their ballistic missile and drone capabilities.
But the alternative we're living through right now is a global economic hostage situation. We are watching the international dynamics fundamentally shift away from the West. Because the U.S. is acting unilaterally, countries in the global South are realizing they are completely exposed to the whims of American foreign policy.
They've always been exposed to global markets.
But when a single military decision in Washington can trigger a massive spike in global food and energy prices, forcing interest rates high and crushing developing economies, those nations are naturally going to seek alternatives.
Which leads to BRICS.
Exactly. That is why you see the rapid acceleration of South-South cooperation. That's why nations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia are flocking to the BRICS economic frameworks. They are actively trying to build economic and diplomatic firewalls against Western unilateralism.
Which, again, accelerates a necessary transition. The post-World War II consensus has been dying a slow death for 20 years. If it takes the shock of Operation Epic Fury to finally force the international community to realize that old treaties and outdated alliances cannot secure the 21st century, well, then that is a historical necessity.
A historical necessity that might cost us the very global stability required to build whatever comes next.
Let's step back and summarize where we stand, because we've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from pipeline politics in Eastern Europe to inflation in Latin America.
We certainly have.
My core position remains that the short-term economic disruptions, the inflation, the oil spikes, the diplomatic realignments we are seeing from Brussels to the global South are the painful but absolutely necessary costs of neutralizing a state-sponsored threat network.
And I completely disagree on the necessity.
We cannot update obsolete global alliances without stressing them first. The military actions taken in the Middle East are actively dismantling the supply chains that feed aggression in Eastern Europe and forcing the free world to stop relying on fragile, single-point vulnerabilities in global trade.
And my position remains that this unilateral military action has triggered a highly dangerous geopolitical unraveling. We are seeing severe damage to the global economy that disproportionately harms the most vulnerable nations.
I acknowledge the harm is real.
By acting without the consensus of our traditional allies, the United States is isolating itself, fracturing international stability, and creating massive strategic vacuums that rivals like China are already exploiting to rewrite the rules of global power.
We are alienating the international community at the exact time when complex cross-border challenges desperately require multilateral cooperation.
Yet despite our profound disagreements on the justification and the execution of this operation, I believe we both acknowledge a fundamental truth here.
Which is?
The ripple effects of the Strait of Hormuz closure, the fracturing of NATO's operational consensus, and the shifting economic dynamic between the US, China, and the global South are going to fundamentally alter international economics and diplomacy for decades.
Oh, absolutely.
The tectonic plates of global power are shifting in real time. Whether you view this as a necessary demolition of an old order or the reckless destruction of global stability, the reality is that the map is being redrawn.
Definitely.
And it is vital that we examine these events not just from a strictly Western policy lens, but from a truly global perspective. How this impacts a factory worker in Beijing facing new AI-driven economic mandates, a citizen facing rolling blackouts in Cuba, or a consumer in Europe paying double for energy is just as critical to the future of the global order as what happens in the corridors of the Pentagon.
There is clearly much more to explore in the source material as the situation develops, and the long-term consequences of these market trends and diplomatic rifts will unfold over years, not days. We leave it to you, the listener, to draw your own conclusions about the future of this new global order.
It's a lot to consider.
But think back to that assembly line we talked about at the beginning. We know production has halted. We know the old supply chains are being violently dismantled. The question that remains is, when the factories finally power back up, who will own the means of production and who will be left out in the cold?
A question we will all have to answer.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.